She didn't disappear because another woman wore his ring. She disappeared because she found the list. Hidden inside the false bottom of Soren Calder's private safe, behind the bearer bonds and the blood money, was a handwritten document ranking every member of his inner circle by operational value. Revna Thorne's name sat dead last. Below the drivers, below the door guards, aside a single word in his own handwriting: dispensable. She had given him 5 years, her entire adult life folded silently into the machinery of his empire. When she vanished 12 hours before his engagement gala, she took nothing with her except the one secret that could bring his entire operation to its knees. The chandelier, above the grand ballroom of the Calder estate, cast fractured light across 400 crystal flutes of champagne that no one had touched yet. The air was thick with the scent of stargazer lilies, freshly ironed linen, and the faint chemical sweetness of hairspray drifting from the army of stylists in the East Wing. Soren stood in the private dressing suite on the second floor, staring at his reflection in the floor-length mirror. The tuxedo was ink black, cut razor close against his shoulders, tailored to conceal the compact holster pressing against his left rib cage. His face betrayed nothing. It never did. He looked like a man carved from granite and dressed in silk, and that was precisely the point. "You need to smile tonight, Soren." Katrin Lord spoke from behind him, without looking up. She sat on the velvet chaise near the window, her legs crossed, a tablet balanced on her knee. Her dark auburn hair was pinned into an architectural updo that must have taken 2 hours and 3 people to construct. She was stunning, in the way a loaded weapon was stunning, precise, deliberate, and built entirely for impact. "My father's associates will be watching. They need to believe this is real." "It is real," Soren replied flatly, adjusting his cufflinks. "2 families merging, shipping lanes and territory. That is as real as it gets." Katrin let out a thin, practiced sigh. "You know what I mean. Romantic, convincing. The Serrano family is sending a delegation tonight. If they suspect this is purely transactional, they will try to renegotiate the harbor tariffs before the ink dries." Soren didn't respond. He was looking at the antique writing desk in the corner of the room. The surface was bare. No leather folio, no printed itinerary with the evening schedule broken down in 15-minute increments. No small glass of ice water with exactly 2 cubes placed at his right hand before he asked for it. Revna hadn't prepared the room. The absence registered in his chest like a skipped heartbeat, a glitch in the rhythm of a machine that never malfunctioned. Revna Thorne had been his chief of operations for 5 years, not his secretary, not his assistant. She was the central nervous system of the Calder Syndicate, the woman who tracked every dollar, every shipment, every bribe, every threat. She knew the rotation schedules of the harbor patrols. She knew which judges were bought, and which ones needed a softer approach. She could read a room full of armed men faster than he could, and she did it from behind a stack of accounting ledgers, with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of someone who understood that real power never raised its voice. She had a way of existing in the margins of a room that made you forget she was there until you needed something, and then she materialized with the exact answer before you finished the question. When Soren's rival, Petro Kazan, had sent 4 of his enforcers to crash a private meeting last spring, Revna had walked directly between them and the conference table without flinching, set down a tray of espresso cups, and calmly informed the lead enforcer that he was standing on a pressure plate. He wasn't. There was no explosive, but the 4 men had backed out of the room so fast, they tripped over each other, and Revna had simply collected the untouched espresso cups and walked back to her desk. That was who she was, unshakable, invisible, essential, and now the desk was empty. The room was wrong. The air tasted incomplete. "Where is Revna?" Soren asked, his voice carrying the low, controlled vibration of a man who did not tolerate disruptions. Katrin glanced up from her tablet. "Your operations girl? I haven't seen her. She's probably finalizing the catering manifest, or arguing with the florist." Why? She hasn't checked in since this morning, Soren said. He pulled his phone from the inside pocket of the tuxedo and scrolled through his messages. Nothing from Revna in 9 hours. 9 hours of silence from a woman who sent him situational updates every 45 minutes like clockwork. Even when she slept, and he was not entirely sure she ever did, her reports were time-stamped and delivered without fail. A cold knot began to form at the base of his throat. Soren, focus. Katrin set the tablet down, her green eyes sharpening. 400 people are arriving in 90 minutes. My father is flying in from Montreal. The Serrano delegation wants a private audience before the toast. I need you present, not chasing after a staff member who is probably having a personal crisis on company time. Soren turned slowly and looked at Katrin. He studied her, the way he studied a contract before signing it, searching for the clause designed to cut him. Her skin was flawless, her nails lacquered a deep burgundy. Her entire existence was a curated performance, and she executed it flawlessly. But her eyes, those sharp, calculating green eyes, held no warmth when she spoke about Revna. They held nothing at all. She is not a staff member, Soren said quietly. His voice didn't rise. It dropped. And the men who knew him well enough understood that the drop was far more dangerous than a shout. She holds the access codes to the offshore vaults. She has the only physical copy of the distribution manifests for the harbor routes. If she is missing, either someone took her or she is running. Either way, I am not standing in a ballroom making small talk while a hole that size exists in my operation. Katrin stood up, smoothing down the front of her emerald gown. The silk caught the light, shimmering like the surface of a deep, cold lake. Then, send Breck, send a team. That is what they are paid for. You are the head of this family, Soren. You do not go crawling after people who wander off. Soren strapped the holster tighter against his ribs. The compact weight of the firearms settled against his body, like an old habit. I don't send people to find my vulnerabilities, Katrin. I find them myself. He walked past her without another word. The heavy oak door of the dressing suite clicked shut behind him, and he moved down the corridor with long, purposeful strides, the polished marble echoing beneath his dress shoes. He took the service stairs, bypassing the main staircase, where the event coordinator was directing a fleet of servers carrying silver trays. He didn't want to be seen leaving. Not yet. Breck was leaning against the black armored sedan parked behind the kitchen wing, a cigarette tucked behind his ear, his heavy arms folded across his chest. The big man straightened the moment Soren appeared. "We're not staying for the party?" Breck asked, reading his boss's face in half a second. "Pull up Revna's home address," Soren ordered, sliding into the passenger seat. "The one on file with the security detail." Breck pulled out his phone, scrolled, and stopped. His brow creased. "Boss, this address is in the Velmore district. That's Kazan territory. We've got a standing agreement not to move through there until the alliance with the Lourdes family is formalized." Soren stared through the windshield at the manicured gardens of his estate, the string lights glowing like trapped fireflies in the hedgerows, the white linen tents billowing gently in the evening breeze. A beautiful cage built for a party he no longer cared about. "Drive," Soren said. The sedan pulled away from the estate, gravel crunching beneath the heavy tires. Behind them, 400 champagne flutes waited to be lifted in celebration of a union that was already cracking at the foundation. Soren leaned back against the leather headrest, his jaw clenched. Why was Revna Thorn living in the one part of the city where his name meant nothing? The Velmore district announced itself long before the street signs confirmed it. The smooth asphalt of the central city gave way to cracked, uneven pavement, riddled with potholes, deep enough to swallow a tire. The sedan's headlights carved through a low, clinging mist that smelled of standing water and industrial runoff. The buildings on either side of the road leaned inward, narrow and exhausted, their facades streaked with decades of soot and neglect. Fire escapes clung to the brickwork like rusted skeletons. Half the street lamps were dead, and the ones that still worked cast a sickly amber glow that barely touched the sidewalks below. Breck drove slowly, his thick fingers tight on the wheel, his eyes scanning the shadows between parked cars and overflowing dumpsters. The deeper they pushed into the district, the quieter the streets became. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping neighborhood, the held-breath quiet of a place that had learned to stay invisible after sundown. Soren watched the buildings slide past through the rain-spotted window. He paid Revna a salary that could have bought her a penthouse in the Alder Heights Towers, with a concierge and secure parking and windows that looked out over the harbor. He had never asked where she lived. He had never thought to ask. She arrived before him every morning and left after him every night, and the hours between belonged to a woman he apparently did not know at all. That thought burned worse than the cold. "This is it," Breck muttered, pulling the sedan against the curb in front of a 5-story building that looked like it had been condemned, and then simply forgotten. The front entrance was a heavy steel door, dented and scratched, propped open with a cinder block. A hand-lettered sign taped to the wall read, "Buzzer broken," in faded marker. Above the door a single bulb hung from a frayed wire, swinging gently in the damp breeze. "Stay with the car," Soren said, stepping out into the mist. "Boss," Breck started, engine running. Soren shut the door and walked toward the entrance, his dress shoes clicking against the broken concrete. He still wore the tuxedo. He looked absurdly out of place. A man dressed for a gala, walking into a building that smelled like it was slowly rotting from the inside out. The stairwell was worse than the exterior. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, cooking grease, and something sharp and acrid that coated the back of his throat. The walls were bare concrete, stained with water damage. Every step he climbed produced a groan from the warped wooden treads. He passed the second floor. A dog barked furiously behind a thin door, scratching and whining. On the third floor, someone was playing music, a tinny, distorted melody leaking through the walls like a half-remembered dream. The fourth floor was silent. Apartment 411. The door was steel, heavier than the others on the floor, reinforced with a deadbolt and a secondary chain lock that Soren recognized as military grade. The chain hung loose, the mounting bracket ripped clean out of the wooden frame, leaving pale, splintered gouges in the door jamb. Someone had forced entry with significant strength. Recently, the splinters were still sharp, not yet discolored by the damp air. The deadbolt itself was not engaged. Soren drew his weapon. He pressed his shoulder against the wall beside the door and pushed it inward. The steel swung open with a low metallic groan. The apartment was lightless. The air inside was colder than the stairwell, a wet, invasive cold that settled into the joints and the teeth. Soren stepped inside, sweeping the barrel across the room. The first thing he registered was the absence. There was almost nothing here. A narrow, metal-framed cot pushed against the far wall, covered with a single wool blanket, folded with military precision. A wooden crate turned on its side, serving as a nightstand, holding a small reading lamp and a battered paperback with a cracked spine. No couch, no television, no pictures on the walls. The only sign of real habitation was a long folding table set up beneath the single window. On it sat 3 monitors, a secured laptop, 2 encrypted satellite phones, and a filing system so meticulously organized that the colored tabs formed a perfect, unbroken gradient from left to right. His operation, his logistics, his entire empire, cataloged and maintained in a freezing 1-room apartment that cost less per month than the champagne being poured at his gala right now. Soren's stomach turned. A narrow kitchenette branched off to the right. The counter held a single mug, a jar of instant coffee, and a half-empty box of plain crackers. Then he heard it, a thin, shallow sound, barely audible above the ambient noise of the building. Breathing. Uneven, labored breathing coming from behind the closed bathroom door at the end of the short hallway. And beneath the door, catching the faint light from the kitchenette, A wet stain was slowly spreading across the cracked tile floor. Soren covered the distance in 3 strides. He pushed the door open with the back of his hand, leading with his weapon. Revna was sitting on the floor, with her back propped against the base of the sink. The overhead light was dead. The only illumination came from the pale blue glow of a phone screen resting face-up on the edge of the bathtub, casting her in a ghostly underwater light. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, soaked through across her left side, with a spreading stain that looked black in the blue glow, but smelled unmistakably of iron. Her right hand was clamped over her ribs, fingers slick and trembling. Her left hand lay open on the floor, beside her, palm up, and as if she had simply run out of the strength to keep it closed. Her face was swollen along the right cheekbone, the skin split in a thin, ragged line that had crusted over with dried blood. Her lips were moving slightly, forming words with no sound behind them, as though she were running calculations in her head even now. Soren lowered the gun. The room tilted beneath him. For a man who had ordered executions over breakfast without losing his appetite, the sight of Revna Thorn, bleeding out on a bathroom floor, sent a fracture straight through the center of his chest. She sensed the movement before she saw him. Her eyes opened. They were glassy, fever-bright, struggling to focus. When they finally locked onto his face, she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just exhaled a long, rattling breath that sounded like surrender. "You're wearing the Brioni," she whispered. Her voice was barely there, a dry scrape of sound against the silence. "You hate that tuxedo?" Soren dropped to one knee beside her. The cold tile bit through the fabric of his trousers. He holstered the weapon and reached for her, his hands hovering over the saturated fabric of her shirt, afraid to press, afraid to cause more damage than whatever had already been done. "What happened?" His voice came out harder than he intended, louder. The words cracked against the tile walls like a slap. "Who did this to you?" Revna closed her eyes. "Lower your voice. I'm not deaf. I'm just leaking." Soren's jaw tightened so hard the muscle in his cheek jumped. He carefully peeled her hand away from her ribs. She hissed through her teeth, her fingers trying to clamp back down, but she didn't have the strength. Beneath her palm, her shirt was torn open, revealing a deep puncture wound just below her left rib cage. The skin around it was angry, swollen, radiating heat. Infection was already settling in. "How long have you been sitting here?" Soren demanded, pulling off his tuxedo jacket and pressing the bundled silk against the wound. The fabric darkened instantly. "Since this morning," Revna murmured. She tilted her head back against the base of the sink. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale producing a faint, wet crackling sound that made Soren's blood run cold. "Since this morning." She had been bleeding on this floor for over 12 hours, while he stood in a dressing suite adjusting his cufflinks. "Why didn't you call me?" The rawness in his own voice startled him. Revna opened her eyes. The fever was there, clouding everything, but beneath it something else burned. Something sharp and deeply, terrifyingly hurt. She held his gaze for a long, suffocating moment. "I opened your safe," she said. The words landed like a blade between his ribs. Soren went still, completely, dangerously still. The kind of stillness that preceded either absolute control or total violence. "I needed the Navarro shipping codes," Revna continued, her voice thin but steady. "The delegation was requesting updated transit manifests for the gala presentation. The codes were in the secondary partition of the safe, behind the bearer bonds." She swallowed. It sounded dry and painful. "I found the list." "Soren, what list?" But even as he asked, something ugly was already crawling up from the base of his spine. "Your handwriting. Blue ink. Every name in your inner circle, ranked by operational value." Revna's eyes never left his. "Katrin's father is second. Your personal detail captain is fifth." She paused. "I'm last. Below the gate guards, below the drivers who rotate every 6 months, and whose last names you don't bother to learn." Her voice cracked, but not from the wound, from something deeper. "You wrote dispensable, next to my name." The word hung in the freezing air between them. Soren felt it hit his sternum like a hollow point round. He remembered the list. He remembered writing it, 8 months ago, sitting in his study at 2 in the morning, 3 glasses of whiskey deep. Katrin's father, pressuring him to identify redundancies in the organization before the merger. "Trim the fat," Old Man Lord had said. "Show me who you can afford to lose." And Soren, operating on strategy and cold arithmetic, had ranked his people like inventory. He had put Revna last because she wasn't muscle, she wasn't an earner. She wasn't a blood relative or a political asset. On paper, she was an operations coordinator, replaceable. That was what the math said. That was what the whiskey said. That was what the man who hadn't yet realized she was the only thing keeping his world intact had said. "Revna, that list was..." Soren started. "I'm not finished," she cut him off. The sharpness in her voice drew blood, even through the fever. "I found the list at 6 this morning. And I was going to leave. I had my bag packed. It's by the cot." Soren glanced through the open bathroom door. A small canvas duffel sat on the floor beside the narrow bed, zipped and ready. One bag. 5 years of service, and her entire life, fit in one bag. "But then I checked the shipping codes," Revna continued. "And they were wrong." Soren's focus snapped back to her face. The Navarro codes had been altered. Someone changed the transit routing for container series 7 through 84. Those containers hold the Galician arms shipment. The route was redirected from your secure port to a Kazan-controlled receiving dock on the East Channel. Soren felt the temperature in the room plummet. "That's a $30 million weapons transfer," he said slowly. "I know what it is," Revna replied. "I've been logging those shipments for 3 years. Someone inside your organization sold the routing codes to Kazan." The altered manifest was backdated to look like an administrative error, but the digital fingerprint on the override belonged to a terminal inside your estate. "Inside my estate," Soren repeated. His voice was barely audible. Revna nodded, wincing at the movement. "I traced the terminal access log. The override was executed at 11:47 last Tuesday night. The only people with access to that terminal after hours are you, Breck, and Katrin." She let that hang. "I didn't leave when I found the codes," Revna said. Her hand found the edge of the sink and gripped it, her knuckles bone white. "I should have. You wrote, dispensable. You gave me every reason to walk out and let the whole thing burn." She looked at him, and the raw, unguarded anguish in her expression nearly broke him open. "But I couldn't. Because if Kazan gets those weapons, he doesn't just take your shipping lanes. He takes the entire Eastern Seaboard distribution network. Your men on the harbor crews lose their livelihoods. The families in the Millhaven housing block that you quietly fund through the Shell charity lose their homes. 300 people who have never heard your name and never will get destroyed because someone in your inner circle sold you out." Her chest heaved. The crackling in her lungs grew louder. "So I went to intercept the courier, carrying the physical confirmation of the rerouted shipment." She gestured weakly at her wounded side, then at her swollen face. "The courier was one of Kazan's people. He had a knife and 6 inches of reach on me, but I got the confirmation documents. They're in the filing cabinet. Second drawer, red tab." Soren stared at her. She had found a list, calling her disposable. She had packed a bag to leave. And then she had risked her life to protect an empire, run by a man who had written her off on a piece of paper. Why? The question left his mouth stripped of everything. No authority. No command. Just a man kneeling on a cold floor, realizing he had been looking at the wrong things for 5 years. Revna's split lips twisted into something too tired and too bitter to be called a smile. "Because you ranked people by what they could do for you. Soren, you always have. I'm last on your list because I don't carry a gun, and I don't share your bed, and I don't have a father with a shipping fleet." She looked away, staring at the cracked tile wall. "But I'm the one bleeding on this floor for you. So maybe your list is wrong." The silence that followed was so heavy Soren could feel it, pressing against his eardrums. "And I live like this," she added quietly, because my brother Morate's spinal care costs $9,000 a month. The rehabilitation facility in Halcourt is the only one in the state with the neurological program he needs. He was 17 when a stray round from a turf war between Kazan and the Delacroix family severed his spine at the third vertebra. He never fired a gun. He was walking home from a library. Soren felt a knot form in his throat, hard and immovable. So, I kept my expenses at zero, Revna continued. Every paycheck goes to Halcourt. Every cent. If you knew I had a dependent, you would have seen it as leverage, a liability. And I couldn't afford to be a liability, Soren. Not when I was already last on your list. He looked at the tuxedo jacket pressed against her ribs, the silk completely ruined, soaked through with her blood. He looked at the single bag by the cot. He looked at the empty apartment that held nothing of her own life, and everything of his. She had starved herself into invisibility to protect a brother she loved, and a man who didn't deserve it. "Give me your phone," he said. Revna blinked. "What?" "Your phone. On the bathtub." She reached over with a shaking hand and passed him the cracked device. He turned it toward her. "Unlock it." She pressed her thumb against the screen, her hand trembling so badly. It took 2 attempts. Soren took the phone, scrolled through the contacts, and hit a name. The phone rang twice. "Breck. Get Victor to Revna's address. 4th floor, apartment 411. Full trauma kit. Now." He paused, staring down at Revna's face. Her eyelids were fluttering, the fever dragging her under. "And Breck, cancel the gala." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 3 full seconds. "Boss, there are 400 people in the ballroom. Katrin's father just landed on the helipad. The Serrano delegation is already seated." Soren looked at the blood, drying in the cracks of the bathroom tile. He looked at the woman who had packed a bag to leave him and then bled for him. "Anyway, there is no gala. There is no engagement. Tell the guests there has been a security threat and clear the estate. And Breck, do not let Katrin leave the property. Lock the gates. No one in, no one out." He could hear Breck breathing on the other end, processing the magnitude of what had just been ordered. "Understood, boss." Soren ended the call. He set the phone on the edge of the sink. Then he shrugged off his holster, rolled up the sleeves of his dress shirt, and leaned forward, carefully adjusting the pressure of the ruined jacket against her wound. "Hold still," he told her. His voice was stripped raw, barely holding together. Revna looked up at him. The man who had put her name at the bottom of a list was kneeling in her blood, his $4,000 tuxedo soaked through his hands, shaking in a way she had never seen in 5 years, of washing him face down armed men, without blinking. "You're ruining the Brioni," she murmured, her eyes sliding shut. "I'll burn every suit I own," Soren said quietly. "Stay awake, Revna. Stay awake." Victor arrived 11 minutes later, a compact, silver-haired man carrying a heavy field trauma bag and wearing the expression of someone who had been pulled away from a very expensive bottle of wine. Breck had carried him up the 4 flights of stairs like luggage, and the doctor was still catching his breath when he knelt beside Revna on the bathroom floor. "How long?" Victor asked, snapping on nitrile gloves and lifting the blood-soaked tuxedo jacket from her ribs. "She says 12 hours, Soren replied from the doorway. His arms crossed, his back pressed against the frame. He couldn't bring himself to leave the room, but he couldn't stay on his knees any longer. Standing was the only way to keep the tremor in his hands invisible. Victor probed the wound with practiced fingers. Prevna's entire body seized, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping through her clenched teeth. Blade went deep, missed the spleen by a margin I am not comfortable discussing. The infection is aggressive. She's running a fever north of 103, and her blood pressure is dangerously low. Victor looked over his shoulder at Soren. "She needs a hospital." "No hospitals," Revna rasped, her eyes still closed. "Hospitals file reports. Reports generate questions." "She's right," Soren said flatly. "Bring her to the estate. Use the North Wing suite. Whatever equipment you need, you will have it within the hour." Victor packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, taped it down with field dressings, and hooked a bag of saline to a portable IV stand rigged from the shower curtain rod. Breck carried Revna down the stairs, wrapped in the wool blanket from her cot, the IV bag resting on her stomach. She weighed almost nothing. Soren walked behind them, carrying the filing cabinet's second drawer in his arms, the red-tabbed documents pressed against his chest. The drive back to the estate was conducted in suffocating silence. Revna drifted in and out of consciousness in the back seat, her head resting against Soren's shoulder. Every time the sedan hit a pothole, she flinched, and every flinch sent a jolt of guilt straight through his sternum. The gates of the Calder estate were closed and lit by floodlights when they arrived. The ballroom windows were unlit. 400 guests had been evacuated. The only vehicle remaining in the circular driveway was Katrin's black town car. Breck carried Revna upstairs. Victor followed. Soren watched them disappear around the curve of the staircase, then turned and walked toward the east drawing room. He pushed the door open without knocking. Katrin was standing by the fireplace, still wearing the emerald gown. Her arms were folded, her face was a perfect mask of controlled fury. "You cleared my gala," she said. Her voice was low, vibrating with restrained rage. "You humiliated me in front of 400 people, including my father, and you locked me in this house like a prisoner. I want an explanation, and I want it now." Soren closed the door behind him. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. He didn't sit. He didn't offer her a drink. He just looked at her with the same quiet, lethal focus he used when studying an enemy across a negotiation table. "Container Series 7, 7 through 84, Soren said softly. "The Galician arms shipment. $30 million of product rerouted from my secure port to a Kazan receiving dock on the East Channel." Katrin's expression didn't change, not a flicker. "The digital override was executed from a terminal inside this estate," Soren continued. "Last Tuesday night, at 11:47, you were the only person with access after I went to bed." "That is absurd," Katrin said, but her voice had shifted. A fraction of a degree colder, harder. "You are accusing me based on the paranoid ramblings of a woman who lives in a condemned building?" "I'm accusing you based on shipping manifests, terminal access, logs, and a confirmation document that my operations coordinator pulled from a Kazan courier's hands while he was trying to kill her with a hunting knife." Katrin's fingers tightened on her folded arms. The first visible crack. Soren pulled out his own phone. He dialed the number and put it on speaker. The line connected after one ring. A voice answered, thick, accented, cautious. "Mr. Lourdes?" Soren said. The voice on the other end went silent. "Your daughter's engagement is terminated. The Lourdes-Calder alliance is dissolved. Your access to my ports, my routes, and my territory. You cannot do this." The old man's voice came back trembling, with barely contained fury. "We have agreements. We have contracts. Your daughter sold my arms, shipment to Petro Kazan. Your contracts are void." The color had drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of old milk. "If I see a lured vehicle in my city by sunrise, I will treat it as an act of war. And Mr. Lourdes, your daughter is free to leave tonight." But she leaves with nothing. Not a document, not a contact list, not a single piece of information about my operation. "If I find out otherwise, you won't receive a phone call next time. You'll receive a delivery." He ended the call without waiting for a response. Katrin stared at him. For a long, terrible moment, neither of them spoke. Then her mask crumbled. The composed, immaculate facade dissolved into something ugly and raw. "You're throwing away everything," she hissed. "For a woman who sleeps on a cot and eats crackers for dinner. She is nothing, Soren. She is a line item. You said it yourself. Dispensable." The word hit him like a fist, because she was right. He had said it, he had written it, and Revna had read it. "Get out of my house," Soren said. His voice was barely audible. The most dangerous it had ever been. The north wing suite smelled of antiseptic, copper, and the faint sweetness of the IV fluids dripping steadily into Revna's arm. Victor had cleaned and sutured the wound, pumped her full of broad-spectrum antibiotics, and wrapped her torso in tight bandages that made her look even smaller against the enormous white bed. The bruising on her face was darkening by the hour. Soren sat in the armchair beside the window, the red-tabbed documents spread across his lap, reading by the light of a single brass lamp. It was past 1 in the morning. The estate was silent. Katrin's town car had left the property 2 hours ago, escorted by Breck to the city limits. He had been reading the documents Revna had pulled from the courier, the confirmation of the rerouted shipment, the amended manifest, the financial trail linking the Lord's family accounts to a Kazan holding company in Vilnius. But the documents only told half the story. The encrypted files on Revna's laptop, still sitting on the folding table in her apartment, held the rest. And Soren couldn't crack them. She had built the encryption herself, a layered protocol that his own security team couldn't touch. He leaned his head back against the chair, pressing his knuckles against his closed eyelids. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 1:30. A sound from the hallway made him open his eyes. Not footsteps, something slower. A shuffling drag, punctuated by the soft, rhythmic squeak of rubber wheels on polished hardwood. Soren was on his feet and at the door in 3 strides. He pulled it open. Revna was standing in the hallway, barefoot, wearing one of his white dress shirts that fell past her knees. Her left arm was wrapped around the IV pole, using it as a crutch. The bandages around her torso were visible through the open collar. Her right hand was braced against the wall. She looked like she had crawled out of her own grave. Her eyes were absolutely alive. "No," Soren said. "One word." "A complete sentence. You can't read the files," Revna said. "It wasn't a question. Get back in bed." "The shipment moves at 4 in the morning," Revna continued, ignoring him completely. She took another shuffling step, the IV pole squeaking in protest. "If Kazan takes possession of those weapons, he doesn't just arm his own crew. He has enough firepower to challenge you for the entire Eastern Corridor. Your harbor crews, your warehouse staff, your transport drivers, 600 people on your payroll become targets overnight." Soren closed the distance between them. He stood directly in front of her, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her feverish skin. She tilted her head back to meet his eyes, and the movement cost her. Her jaw tightened against the pain. "You are bleeding through your bandages," Soren said, his voice a low, rough scrape. "And you are wasting time," she fired back. The sharpness in her voice was a ghost of its usual precision, dulled by fever and blood loss but still cutting enough to land. "I built that encryption. I am the only person who can open those files. And those files contain the complete list of every person inside your organization that Katrin compromised. It's not just her, Soren. She recruited." The words hit like cold water. "How many?" Soren asked. "I don't know yet. That's why I need my laptop." They stared at each other in the dimly lit hallway. The grandfather clock ticked. The IV drip counted its own quiet rhythm. Soren exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath. He reached out and took the IV pole from her grip, transferring her weight to his free arm. She didn't resist. She leaned into him, her forehead briefly touching his collarbone, and he felt the shudder run through her body like an aftershock. 30 minutes, he said. 45, she countered. He half carried her to his study. The room was warm, heated by the remnants of a fire. In the stone hearth, he lowered her into his leather desk chair, propping her bare feet on a pulled-out drawer. Breck had retrieved the laptop and the filing system from the Velmore apartment an hour ago. It sat on the desk, waiting. Revna's fingers found the keyboard. They trembled badly, the fever and the painkillers waging war against her muscle memory. But the encryption protocol was written into her bones. She bypassed the first layer in under 90 seconds. Soren stood behind the chair, watching the screen fill with data. "Here," Revna said, pulling up a communications log. Katrin didn't just sell the shipping codes. She's been feeding Kazan intelligence for 7 months. Safe house locations, your travel schedule. And here, Revna opened a second file. Financial transfers from a Lord subsidiary to 3 members of your personal security detail. The amounts are small, staggered, designed to look like bonuses, but the timing correlates exactly with 3 separate security breaches you experienced this year. The break-in at the Harwich warehouse in January, Soren said slowly, and the ambush on the Coast Road in March, and the leak of your meeting location with the Navarro family in April. All 3 were inside jobs. All 3 were paid for by Katrin's family. Soren's hands tightened on the back of the chair until the leather creaked. She was mapping your entire operation, Revna said quietly, preparing for a full takeover after the wedding. Your organization would have been absorbed into the Lord network within 6 months. You would have been managing director in name only, or buried, if that was more convenient. She looked up at him over her shoulder. The firelight caught the bruise on her cheekbone, the split skin, the exhaustion carved into every line of her face. The engagement wasn't a merger, Soren. It was a cage. And you were building it yourself. The room was silent except for the fire and the rain. Soren reached past her and picked up the desk phone. He dialed Breck. The 3 guards on the compromised list. Soren's voice was colorless. Disarm them, quietly. Lock them in the East Wing basement, then pull the harbor crew, and every man you trust, to the estate armory. Full tactical load, suppressed weapons only. He set the phone down and looked at the clock on the mantel. It was 2:15. The shipment moved at 4. I need the exact coordinates of the East Channel receiving dock, Soren said. Revna was already pulling up the map. The East Channel receiving dock sat at the dead end of a derelict industrial spur, wedged between a decommissioned grain elevator and the oily water of the harbor. The fog had thickened since midnight, rolling off the surface in dense, slow-moving banks that swallowed sound and light. The air tasted of salt, diesel, and rust. Soren stepped out of the armored sedan 100 yards east of the dock, behind the rusted hulk of an abandoned container crane. He wore black. No tuxedo, no silk. A tactical vest over a long-sleeved shirt, the compact firearm holstered at his side, a second weapon strapped to his ankle. Breck flanked him, carrying a suppressed shotgun at low ready. Behind them, 8 of Soren's men fanned out into the mist, moving between the stacked shipping containers with the practiced silence of men who had done this before. Nobody spoke. Drevna had pulled the dock schematics, the camera positions, the access points, the blind spots. She had marked them on a printed layout with the same precise, color-coded tabs she used for his filing system. Every man had memorized his assignment. Before he left the study, Soren had set a loaded weapon on the desk beside Revna's keyboard. She had looked at the gun, then looked at him. "I'll figure it out," she had said, and the flat, exhausted certainty in her voice told him she meant it. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She had nodded once. The deadbolt had engaged behind him, with a sound that settled something deep in his chest. Now, standing in the fog at the edge of the dock, Soren listened. The low rumble of heavy diesel engines reached him through the mist. 2 box trucks moving slowly, their headlights off, navigating the narrow access road by the glow of parking lamps. They pulled onto the dock and parked nose to tail in front of the warehouse loading bay. The bay door was already raised. Inside, a forklift sat ready beside neatly stacked wooden crates, stamped with agricultural labeling that fooled no one who knew what to look for. $30 million of Galician hardware waiting to change hands. A figure stepped out of the warehouse into the glow of the loading bay lights. Tall, lean, smoking a thin cigar. Soren recognized him instantly. Marin Devil, Kazan's chief lieutenant. 4 men climbed out of the trucks carrying unsuppressed rifles with the lazy confidence of a crew expecting a routine pickup. Devil checked his watch. He took a long pull on the cigar, the cherry flaring orange in the mist. "Right on time," Davil said, his voice carrying across the wet concrete. Lord said the codes would work. She wasn't bluffing. Kill the dock lights, Soren said into the earpiece. A metallic clunk echoed across the yard. The loading bay floods went black. The dock plunged into smothering blackness. Davil's cigar was the only point of light, a tiny orange ember, floating in the void. From the tops of the shipping containers, Soren's men opened fire. The suppressed weapons produced flat, percussive coughs that were swallowed by the mist almost instantly. The first truck driver dropped before his hand found his rifle. The second took a round through the shoulder and spun against the cab. Two of the remaining men managed to raise their rifles before Breck's shotgun barked twice from the shadows and put them both on the ground. Davil dropped his cigar. He stumbled backward, reaching for the weapon under his coat, but Soren was already walking out of the darkness. The gravel didn't crunch beneath his boots. The fog parted around him like a curtain. Davil saw him and froze. His hand stopped halfway to his holster. Calder, Davil breathed. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. What remained was a man staring at the thin margin between negotiation and a body bag. Soren stopped 6 feet away. Tell Kazan the shipment stays where it is, Soren said. His voice carried no anger, no heat. Just the flat, terminal certainty of a man who had already made every decision that mattered tonight. This was a Lourdes arrangement, Davil stammered. We had authorization. Katrin gave us the codes herself. Katrin Lourdes no longer speaks for my organization, Soren said. She doesn't speak at all. Not anymore. Davil's eyes darted to the bodies of his men. Then back to Soren. Soren took one step closer. You are going to drive these trucks back to Kazan. You are going to tell him that the Calder ports are closed to him permanently. Every route, every dock, every warehouse. And you are going to tell him something else. What? Davil's voice cracked on the single syllable. Tell him my operations coordinator sends her regards. The woman his courier put a knife into this morning is the reason his entire eastern expansion just died in this fog. And if he sends anyone into my territory again, I won't leave witnesses to carry messages. Davil stood perfectly still for 5 long seconds. Then he turned, climbed into the lead truck, and drove away. The second truck followed, its taillights swallowed by the mist before it reached the access road. Boss, Breck said quietly from behind him. It's done. Soren holstered his weapon. He turned his back on the loading bay, on the blood drying on the concrete, on the cigar still smoldering in a puddle of rainwater. Take me home, Soren said. The estate was unlit when the sedan pulled through the gates. Every window black, except for a single warm glow coming from the second-floor study. Soren climbed the stairs without speaking. His boots left wet prints on the marble. He smelled of fog, cordite, and harbor water. The study door was locked. He pressed his palm flat against the wood. Revna, he said. A pause. The scrape of the desk chair. The deadbolt turned. The door opened. Revna stood in the frame, swallowed by his white shirt, the loaded weapon hanging at her side, with her finger resting flat along the barrel. Her face was chalk white, the bruise nearly black in the low light. Her eyes searched his face, his hands, his chest, cataloging, looking for damage. You're whole, she whispered. Soren stepped inside and closed the door. He reached down and gently took the gun from her hand, engaging the safety with his thumb, and setting it on the bookshelf. Kazan's lieutenant took the message. The shipment is secure. The compromised guards are in the basement. Revna closed her eyes. The tension that had been holding her upright released all at once, and she listed forward. Soren caught her, one hand on her waist, the other on the back of her neck. She pressed her forehead against his collarbone and breathed. He could feel her ribs expanding beneath his palm, each breath shallow and effortful but steady. For a long, quiet moment, neither of them moved. I read the list again tonight, Soren said into her hair. His voice was rough, scraped raw by the night, while you were asleep before Victor arrived. I read every name. She didn't lift her head. She just listened, her fingers curling into the front of his tactical vest. I wrote that list because Catherine's father asked me to identify who I could afford to lose. And I put your name last because I didn't understand the difference between someone I could replace and someone I couldn't survive without. Revna's breathing hitched. I can replace muscle, Soren continued. I can replace money. I can replace alliances. He pulled back, just enough to tilt her face up. Her eyes were wet. The first time he had ever seen tears threatening to break through her composure. I cannot replace the woman who packed a bag to leave me and then bled on a bathroom floor to save me anyway. Revna's jaw tightened. She was fighting it. Fighting the collapse, the vulnerability, the terrifying act of being seen by a man she had spent 5 years hiding from. I'm still your operations coordinator, she said, and her voice shook on every syllable. No, Soren said. He pressed his thumb gently against the unbruised side of her jaw. You are my partner, and that list is ash. I burned it in the fireplace an hour before I left for the docks. Revna looked at him. The walls she had built, the discipline, the invisibility, the quiet, relentless self-erasure, cracked and fell away. Marette's facility, she started, is fully funded through my private trust as of 30 minutes ago, Soren said. I had Breck make the call on the drive back. Your brother will never lose his bed, and you are never going back to that apartment in the Velmore. Revna's lips parted. You can't just restructure my entire life. I'm going to need a raise, she whispered. Soren's chest shook with a single quiet laugh, the first real one in months. He picked her up, ignoring her faint protest, and carried her out of the study, down the hall and into the master suite. Not the guest room, not the north wing, his room. He set her on the bed, pulled the heavy linen sheets over her shoulders and sat on the edge of the mattress, watching her. She was asleep within 30 seconds, her hand resting on the pillow beside her face. Her fingers still curled as though holding onto something invisible. Soren didn't leave. He sat in the stillness, listening to her breathe, and let the silence rebuild him from the ground up. Morning light poured through the tall arched windows of the master suite, cutting sharp golden lines across the stone floor. Soren stood at the window, dressed in a clean black shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a cup of coffee in one hand, and a newly activated phone in the other. The city sprawled below the estate's hilltop perimeter, glittering with a false innocence in the early sun. The phone buzzed. A Montreal area code, Soren answered. You made a catastrophic mistake, Hal. Henri Lourd's voice was a contained fury wrapped in old money diction. My daughter was humiliated, my associates were turned away at the gates, and I have received very disturbing reports from the East Channel. Soren took a slow sip of coffee. Your daughter sold my shipping routes to Petro-Kazan, Soren said, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. She compromised 3 members of my personal security detail. She facilitated a $30 million arms theft. And she orchestrated the stabbing of my chief of operations, a woman who is currently recovering in my home from a wound inflicted by a Kazan enforcer, carrying credentials your daughter provided. There was a long silence on the line. You have no proof, Henri said, but the confidence was crumbling. I have 7 months of encrypted communications, terminal access logs, financial transfers from your subsidiary accounts to my compromised guards, and a signed confirmation document from the Kazan courier. Soren paused. My operations coordinator is very thorough. From the bed behind him came a soft rustle of sheets. Revna shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. She opened her eyes, blinking against the morning light. She looked at the unfamiliar room, at the heavy stone fireplace, at the linen sheets, and then at Soren, standing by the window. Are you threatening someone before breakfast? She asked, her voice hoarse with sleep. Soren covered the phone's microphone with his thumb. I'm renegotiating. Listen carefully, Henri, Soren said, returning to the call. The Lord family is out, permanently. Your shipping access is revoked. Your financial agreements are voided, And if you or your daughter attempt to contact any member of my organization, I will release every document, every communication, and every financial record to every family on the eastern seaboard. You will not be able to buy a dock slip from here to Savannah. You'll regret this, Henry breathed. I have excellent advisors, Soren said softly, his eyes resting on Revna. I doubt it. He ended the call. So, Revna said, clearing her throat, the Lord's network is out. That's roughly 22% of your operating revenue, tied to their shipping agreements. We need to restructure the port allocations by Thursday, or the Navarro family will try to fill the vacuum and overcharge you by at least 15% on transit fees. Soren walked to the bed. He set his coffee on the nightstand and leaned down, placing his hands on the mattress on either side of her hips. Stop, he said quietly. If we don't move on the Navarro contracts by end of week, she continued, her cheeks flushing faintly at his proximity, the margin compression alone will cost you 2 million a quarter, Revna. He said her name like a door closing on the old world and opening on the new one. Your laptop is locked in the safe. You are not touching a spreadsheet for 2 weeks. Victor is returning at noon. You are going to eat real food and sleep in a real bed, and you are going to let someone take care of you for the first time in 5 years. I don't know how to do that, she admitted. The raw honesty in the words cracked through her professional armor. Then I will teach you, Soren said. His hand came up, his knuckles brushing the uninjured side of her face with a gentleness that contradicted every violent thing he had done in the last 12 hours. And when you are healed, you and I are going to rebuild this organization from the ground up. Together. No lists, no rankings, no desk outside my door. Revna looked at him. The man who had written her off as dispensable was looking at her as though she were the foundation beneath everything he had ever built. She raised her hand and pressed her palm flat against his chest, over his heart. The beat was strong and steady, and entirely hers. You still owe me a raise, she said quietly. Soren leaned down and pressed his lips against her forehead. He stayed there, his breath warm against her skin, a vow sealed without a single word. She didn't leave because she stopped caring. She stayed because she was the only one who saw the blade coming. Brevna Thorne gave everything to a man who had written her name at the bottom of a list, and when the empire crumbled around him, she was the only one still standing in the wreckage. She was never his first choice. She became his only one. If this story hit you right in the chest, smash that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what was your favorite moment of Soren's reckoning. See you in the next one.